What happened to the heavyweight division? So, some years ago, our modern day heavyweight division was starting to look like some of the other great heavyweight eras, like the Muhammad Ali, Joe Frazier, and George Foreman era, or even the Mike Tyson, Evander Holyfield, Lennox Lewis era. That's what the current modern day heavyweight era was starting to look like, with three great fighters that were going to go on to be in the Hall of Fame. Considering every heavyweight era had three dominant names, and they all went on to be great. And that's exactly what we expected, and it's what it was looking like, until it all went out the window. Well, if you guys don't know who I'm referring to the top three names: Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, and Deontay Wilder, who were all three at one point in time considered the heavyweight kings of this generation. And these three were all supposed to go on and fight each other, make huge fights and a lot of money against each other. Because of how dominant all three of them were in the heavyweight division, Anthony Joshua with his heart and aggression, Fury with his slick movement and skill, and Deontay Wilder with his one-punch crazy knockout power. It really was looking like it was going to be exciting for boxing, but most of these fights never actually ended up happening. So how did this happen? Well, to give the short answer, this guy is responsible for ending the heavyweight division for the most part. But in today's video, we're going to break down each fighter's story and how they pretty much all went out bad, and none of them actually ended up coming out on top like we thought. But before we do that, if you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button for everything boxing related. Well, without any further ado, let's jump straight into it with the first fighter, Anthony Joshua. Now, Anthony Joshua was arguably the most popular on this list, and I would say is definitely the most exciting fighter out of these three. However, it seemed that he wasn't actually as good as people thought he was. Towards the beginning, he was a very all-round fighter. People were so excited to see his fights. He had crazy knockout power, and he showed a lot of heart and aggression in his fights, and pretty much dominated a lot of big names in the heavyweight division, eventually becoming unified, holding 3 of the 4 heavyweight world title belts. And I would say at the time he was one of the most promising fighters out of the UK in a long time. However, that was until he had a fight against Andy Ruiz Jr., and I'm sure we all know what happened in that fight. Well, if you guys don't know, Anthony Joshua was set to face Big Baby Miller in another one of a world title defense fights, until Miller tested positive for substances and had to pull out of the fight. As a late replacement, Andy Ruiz Jr. came in and stepped in for Anthony Joshua and was supposed to be just a late replacement, and no one really thought anything of it. However, everyone was completely wrong, as Andy Ruiz dominated AJ in this fight. After getting dropped a couple times, he got up, came right back and finished Joshua, dropping Joshua multiple times and eventually knocking him out. And this is the first time that we've seen Joshua look weak. It was one of the biggest upsets in boxing to date, and no one really expected it. And still to this day, I think this loss is what turned AJ into the fighter he is today, in a bad way. Now, why do I think that is? I think AJ was loved for his aggression, dominance, and knockout power, and for that fire he had when he fought. However, I think him losing to Ruiz in such a bad way, it made him lose his fire and his knockout power. Not power so much, but it made him hesitant to go in for those big knockouts and walk through his opponents, because he faced Ruiz in a rematch and completely outboxed him in 12 rounds. But we saw a very different Anthony Joshua. He was so much more cautious and wanted to adopt a very boxer-like style of hitting and not getting hit. However, that just wasn't Joshua, and so it didn't stick around. But he continued trying with his style, and it hasn't ended up too well for him. He had some wins after he had a rematch against Andy Ruiz, beat some good names until he faced Alexander Usyk, who stepped up from cruiserweight. Now, him and Usyk had 2 good fights, and they were both relatively close, but Usyk did beat Anthony Joshua in both of these fights, basically dethroning AJ for good, proving he is the better fighter than AJ overall. And what really finished AJ off was his recent loss to Daniel Dubois, where he was knocked out and brutally beaten up throughout that whole fight. We saw AJ knocked out worse than he's ever been knocked out before, and we haven't heard much from AJ ever since. So is he going to come back and fight? We're not sure yet, we don't know, but I don't think there's going to be much of a future for Anthony Joshua, unfortunately. Next up, we have Tyson Fury, the Gypsy King, probably the most talented and skilled out of all the fighters on this list, and had some great notable wins, especially to Vladimir Klitschko and some other good names. And as he was starting to step up in the middle of the talks of the 3 heavyweight kings, him and Deontay Wilder were 2 out of 3 of the biggest names in the division and signed to fight. Now, this fight was a crazy fight, very controversial, but it ended up in a draw. Tyson Fury dominated most of the fight, but he got dropped pretty badly, if you guys don't remember, at the end of the fight by one of Deontay Wilder's crazy overhand rights. However, Fury got up somehow and finished the fight. Well, after this, they did have a rematch, which Fury pretty much dominated Deontay Wilder in this one, and even for Tyson Fury, who's going to go on to be one of the best heavyweights in the division and probably come out on top. Well, that was until he signed a random fight against the UFC's heavyweight champ Francis Ngannou, where he surprisingly had a very close fight to Ngannou and was kind of exposed in a way. We saw a lot of flaws from Fury, where Fury was dropped, and arguably people have said that Ngannou got robbed. Well, people kind of forgot about that fight, and Fury was there to avenge Anthony Joshua's losses to Alexander Usyk and prove that he's the best in the heavyweight division because he can beat Usyk. However, the same thing happened to Tyson Fury, and Alexander Usyk proved too good for both of those fighters. Obviously, as you all may know, Tyson Fury had 2 fights also to Alexander Usyk and ended up losing them both. And like I said before, we haven't heard anything from Tyson Fury since. And since this loss, he hasn't expressed a desire to fight anyone else in the division. So could this be the end for him also? We don't know. And last but not least, the third fighter on this list, and probably the most explosive, Deontay the Bronze Bomber Wilder. Now, I'm going to put it bluntly, this guy has pretty much zero skill, but his knockout power is just ridiculous. He's a monster of a human, and he knocks people out in one punch, and was the biggest hitter in the heavyweight division. But unfortunately for Deontay Wilder, it was never going to take him far because that's his only attribute, is his power. He very heavily gets dominated in a lot of his fights, even to lower level opponents, and relies on just that one punch knockout power to finish his opponents. And yeah, this worked against the lower level of opponents, but the second he was going to step up, it was just never going to work. And in a way, it did kind of work against Tyson Fury, as we all know in the first fight. He dropped Tyson Fury pretty bad, and it looked like it was going to be over. And if Tyson Fury didn't have as good of a chin and determination as he did, then it probably would have worked on him. But Tyson was able to get up, finish the fight, and then in the next 2 fights, figure out Deontay and not get caught with shots like that in the second 2 fights. And as I mentioned before, he got beaten up pretty badly in those 2 fights. And in my opinion, I think that's what broke Deontay Wilder. I don't think he was ever the same after his losses to Tyson Fury. And it showed in his performances. He had losses to Joseph Parker and Zhilei Zhang after this, and was pretty much sent to retirement after this. And I think it's fair to say I don't think we'll ever see Deontay Wilder in the ring again. So I think Tyson Fury is pretty much responsible for ending Deontay Wilder's career. Okay, so now we've been over all 3 fighters and how their careers kind of ended. What are some key things to mention from that? Well, Deontay Wilder and Fury actually had a great trilogy, and those 2 actually made the fight happen 3 times, and that's what we all want to see as fans. However, AJ actually ended up fighting none of them, which is interesting because at one point in time there were negotiations for AJ to fight both of them for 9-figure paydays, but he never ended up making them happen. And I think it's fair to say we can't expect AJ to fight either of them in the future at any time. Another thing that's really interesting to mention is that it's crazy how these guys were at the top of their game, and one of these 3 was supposed to come out on top until Usyk came up from cruiserweight and cleared them like it's nothing. But for all these 3 fighters, what do I think should happen now? Well, in my opinion, I don't think Deontay Wilder is going to come out of retirement. I think he's done for good. However, as for Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua, I do believe there is still potential for them 2 to make a huge mega fight, and I still think it would do good numbers. Maybe not as good as it would have done a couple of years ago, but I think a fight like that would still be huge today. And so I think that's the best thing that these 2 can do, is fight for second place. They've both had 2 losses to Usyk, but these 2 going on now to have a fight for second place is the best thing they can do for their careers, in my opinion, and for their legacy. Not to mention they'd both make a lot of money in the process. What do you guys think? What's next for each of these fighters? Let us know in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss an upload. Anyways, that'll be all. I'll catch you in the next one.